This is Voices of Adoption, and I'm Janet Sherlund, author of Abandoned at Birth, Searching for the Arms That Once Held Me, a memoir about the trauma of the adoptee experience. I'm talking with experts and other adoptees about the ways in which adoption shaped our lives and the misconceptions surrounding the adoptee experience. Today, I'm excited to introduce Connor Howe, an Irish-American adoptee, writer, marketer, and advocate living in San Diego. You might know him by his username at adopted_Connor. Connor is known for his adoption education content and his goal of dismantling the toxic adoption industry in America. Connor takes on adoption influencer families, spreading misinformation, advocates for welfare reform, and provides insight into the adoptee experience. Welcome, Connor. And I'm so glad to be speaking to you today. I think there's so much that you add to the conversation about adoption. And particularly, I think one of the first things that really drew me to your content was that you are an adoptee who grew up in the open adoption mythology, that those of us who grew up in the closed and sealed adoption era were all told this was going to change the game. And you're here to tell us it doesn't. Let's just get right into what you think doesn't work about open adoption.
I started really having these profound feelings about adoption as a kid, but I would say I started unpacking everything a few years ago. And I started listening to people like yourself, like all the adopted people who've spoken on podcasts. I've heard you on podcasts before and so many other adopted people. I've read books. And I felt a lot of the similar feelings. I'd go into support groups, I'd go into therapy. And it was weird because, yeah, like you kind of pointed out, I felt like my whole life, it was communicated to me and my families that open adoption solved all these problems that were caused and created by adoption. But I've done a lot of research. I'm kind of like an adoption historian junkie, whatever you would call it. I read everything. I literally have been looking up how open adoption was created, how people came to that being the solution to the closed adoption era, and what the intentions were. Even back in 1976, when open adoption was first actually proposed. And I think it says a lot, by the way, that I am kind of one of the first generations of people growing up in an open adoption, speaking about this publicly 20 years after open adoption was even created. It's very interesting that the industry kind of was like, open adoption is great, but also we're not really going to like do it for another 20, 30 years or whatever. Reading the way that people kind of spoke about open adoption when they were first proposing it, it really felt like a solution to kind of quiet down adopted people, especially those who were very vocal about unsealing birth records in the 1970s. Adopted people really made a lot of noise about unsealing birth records in the 70s, and a lot changed. But open adoption, despite, I think, a lot of the well intentions with people who wanted better for adopted people, so they weren't advocating for birth records in their 50s or whatever. Also, we're kind of proposing it as a solution to increase the supply of adoptable children so that adoptive parents didn't have to wait as long to adopt children. So in my case, I have a very complicated story. I kind of have like a half open, half closed adoption with growing up knowing my mom, but also being a complete secret to my dad. But yeah, I mean, I appreciate you and so many other adopted people for trying to convey what the experience is like. I think there are differences in all of our stories, and I think the adoption industry is very, very intent on pointing out that every adoption is different. When I think if we really look at things from a bigger picture, every adoption is the same in some ways. We all have experienced loss. We all do not have a legal connection to our families of origin. And I think that is something that is deliberately kind of lost on society.
Yeah, and I don't think in our society we don't talk about those kind of connections. We're a very instantaneous, electronic, isolated society. And so issues like just being a whole and integrated human being and just what's important to that, the fact that your connection being mirrored by biological kin, and then you get into the whole argument about who makes a worthy mother, like Rebecca Wellington's wonderful book. And when I read Relinquished by Gretchen Sisson, I was shocked to learn that open adoption isn't legally binding. And that often adopted parents just sort of stop following the agreement that they had made with the birth mother. Did you know when you were a child, do you remember being told at some point, or did you always know that this woman was your birth mother? And did you sort of understand that concept?
Yeah, I mean, I've always known, like, I've known her since childhood, but I think as I've gotten older, I've learned more and more about my own story, even from my adoptive family. I remember not that long ago, I've been trying to gather stuff to write my own memoir, but it's way on the back burner for me. And my adoptive mother's been really helpful with getting me all of the stuff, like every paper she can find from my childhood. And one of those papers was a psychological evaluation that they had me do when I was like, I think 9 or so. And in that psychological evaluation, it was mentioned that I didn't see my mom for, I think it was like 4 years straight, even though we lived in the same city. And I asked everyone, what's up with that? And no one really had an answer. Like not my adoptive family, not my natural mother. Like no one really was able to say anything about that. And I think that kind of speaks to this attitude in open adoption that, yeah, it means one thing when you're presenting open adoption as an option to a pregnant person, and it means an entirely different thing once the papers are signed. The adoption industry really presents open adoption as something of almost like a choice. There's a popular show, Teen Mom, that you can literally see the person, the adoption counselor or whatever, literally telling the couple, "You're in the driver's seat. You have control. This is your choice." And then, of course, 10 or 15 years later, they have no access to their child. Again, not to say that who knows what is best in any given circumstance, but I think adoption explicitly creates a sense of certainty in a completely unpredictable circumstance. When a child is born, no one is ever saying, this is exactly what your child's life is going to look like. But in adoption, especially open adoption, professionals have absolutely no issue with trying to predict the future about children and doing so in a way where they almost come off as an authority figure of, look, this is what your child's going to look like and everyone's going to be happy. And yeah, I think it's gross, and I think adoption agencies know what they're doing. Certainly not every single adoption agency does exactly that, but agencies aren't really making a lot of noise about that being an issue in their industry. And so, yeah, I have a big issue with it.
The needs of the adoptee are not at all part of the equation. And I feel like in our world today, couples feel they're entitled to that. It's not like, oh gosh, if we can't have children, how are we going to, manage this in our lives? And instead, it's just, we'll just adopt. Everyone feels like that's just always out there and that's always an option. When I talk to people, there's just that myth that all birth mothers are heroin addicts. They're always thinking, well, you've got a terrible mother who can't raise a child, and you're giving them to a lovely family that have all the bells and whistles. And no one's ever talking about, but what does that human being that's just been born really need to be a healthy and integrated human being? And, the argument that the options that adopted parents have are better for that child than staying with their birth mother or their kin in a kinship adoption is so wrong, because what we need to be human beings is all about what we're learning about ourselves and the belonging of being with our family of origin. And it's not about being raised by strangers who know nothing about us, and we're so different from them, and we feel that all the time. And there's no respect for that and recognition of that human need to be with your kin and see yourself mirrored. Inevitably, in adoptive families, all the same issues come up. There's alcoholism and drug abuse and mental health issues, and abandonment. And there's every horrible thing that happens in an adoptive family that happens in a biological family. I mean, we're just all human. But, basing adoption on maybe the socioeconomic means of someone is not in the best interest of the child. And it's also so false that birth mothers are all drug addicts and shouldn't have their children. When you were growing up, did you feel different? Did you feel like just a feeling way, like when you were with your adoptive family versus when you were with your birth mother? And I don't know how young you were or how old you were when you first had biological siblings, but did you feel more comfortable in either home?
Yeah, I mean, I have an adoptive brother who's 4 months younger than me, so my adoptive parents were pregnant while they adopted me, which is pretty unusual. I think my mom actually had to sign a bunch of extra papers, basically making exceptions for my adoptive family to adopt me, because the policy of the adoption agency that was working with all of them was that people who already had children were not a priority to adopt, essentially. But yeah, I would say I've always felt different. I mean, obviously having an Irish twin essentially makes things even more complicated, where you have all of the downsides of being twins, but really none of the upsides. And then also, I think the way you phrase the question, I think is interesting to me. I never went to my mom's house until probably I was in high school. I never met pretty much anyone in her life until high school or so. My contact with my mom was her coming over on my adopted family's terms. And I wouldn't say that they did that as a conscious means of control. That's just what they were comfortable with. And I think that's really a disappointing part of adoption is it really puts the adoptive family in complete control when it really should be about what does the child want? What does the child need? And even if people ask me, like, what do you want? I, first of all, probably wasn't ever asked very often, if at all. And then number two, even if I was asked, how comfortable would I really be saying, this is what I want, when adoption just creates such a bizarre and weird social dynamic between all of these families, whereas there's this push and pull where you're afraid that if I go too far to one side, the other side's going to be upset.
In this open adoption you had, that didn't really sound very open to me. If you're not having free, open, independent relationship with your birth mother, but she just is like a visitor that comes to see you sometimes in your adoptive home, that's not a free situation, and that's not a real natural situation. So that doesn't sound very open to me and suitable to you forming a really independent relationship with this woman and getting to know her in a relaxed way. But people are always accusing adoptees of not being grateful. But many of us are grateful for opportunities we had, but we're also silent. You can't speak your truth. They say adoptees either respond, they're hellions and pushing back all the time and testing boundaries, or they're trying to be the perfect child. And when people also say, oh, I know adoptees and they're great, they're successful, they do so well, they're just great. And I'm going, yeah, that's a red flag. And I count myself in having made that choice as a young girl. It's like, no, I just want to be perfect and do everything right. It's someone who's more fearful and more afraid and more rigid and more desperate. And it's not a good sign when adoptees are perfect people. I think it's much healthier when they're testing the waters and pushing back. But that's often an argument for why adoption's really good, because you've got a lot of successful adopted people. And no one asks them what they're really feeling or how hard they're working to get to that spot. They're tap dancing upstream, I always want to say.
I totally agree with you. I'm similar way, like very high achiever, but also tested my adoptive family a lot growing up. I feel like I was on both sides of that spectrum, and I think you put it really well. You feel this inherent compulsion to prove your worthiness in ways I don't think people who aren't adopted understand.
And the anger at adoptees for speaking our truth and people just saying how ungrateful we are. But again, there's no respect for honoring what we've given up, all of our heritage, our family. 98% of America wasn't adopted. And so they can't imagine what it feels like to never have seen anyone who looks like them, to never know where they came from or how they belong by virtue of blood alone. And that connection to mother, where they talk about how our connection to our birth mother is the strongest. It's cellular. Mothers keep the cells of their children in their bloodstream and their brain and vice versa for life. It's such a powerful connection. And even though you knew your birth mother, it was almost like she was a visitor. That bond was broken at birth and you were adopted by people who didn't smell like her, move like her, talk like her, act like her. And people who are not adopted don't understand the trauma of that break, that primal wound. And I'm just shocked at the vitriol that people spew at adoptees who are trying to talk about that.
I also think they interpret our silence as positive feelings, which is why you get so much of the vitriol because people will say, well, I have a friend who hasn't ever complained about adoption. I have a friend or a cousin or someone, and they're happy to be adopted. Do they really know that? Or are they just kind of making that assumption because they're not seeing that person talking about adoption? And why should any adopted person feel comfortable talking about this stuff when, again, there's always this kind of looming threat behind us of we can be relinquished again, essentially. Even if we're adults, like I can be written out of the will or whatever fears any adopted person has. And people will say, well, I might have that fear with my mom and dad, even though I wasn't adopted. Yeah, but you weren't different. You don't have a distinct, profound difference between you and the people who you grew up with. Even if those people love you, it might happen. We've seen it with Warren Buffett disinheriting his, I think, adopted granddaughter or something like that. It happens way more often than people would expect or understand. And people aren't really looking for it. They're interpreting our silence as happiness or positive attitudes because, adopted people can be happy even if they have negative feelings about adoption.
And also you're embarrassed by it because you don't know, because it's not normalized. We don't talk about it. And that's one of the things I think is so important that we need to talk about it so that people understand what's normal. Adoptees understand what's normal. We voice things and we try and make change to this industry. I'm surprised with how many people were shocked by the feelings I wrote about. And for those of us who are adopted and just longing for our authentic identity, when we find it, seeing how much we're like those people and how much that created us, that's a crazy concept to me. I think even an open adoption, to know yourself and to see where you came from, I think you need more than some occasional visits in your adopter's home.
Yeah, it's kind of like a summer camp relationship. You can't really get to know someone when you see them on someone else's terms a couple times a year. You can't build a foundational level of trust with people when you don't know the next time you're going to see them.
What are some of your biggest takeaways from the interaction you have with so many people? What are the top couple things you're fighting against? If you could wave a magic wand and have the world understand two or three things about adoption, where would you start?
Sort of like a question. I mean, I first wanted to say, I feel like I appreciate people like you who try to speak to the adopted person's experience and are working to help adopted people feel seen. I think that's really important. And when I started doing what I'm doing, my attitude was really that, there's a lot of great people doing what you're doing. And really, my desire is to pop the bubble of these adoptee conversations and reach people who are going to say these things of like, you're terrible, you're ungrateful, you're whatever. I feel like I can handle it for whatever reason. I don't know. But I think I would say that for me, a big part of why that is I just want to hold adoption agencies accountable. If you ever watch a documentary on some business that's doing things the wrong way, right? The Chipotle like E. coli documentary. If I'm going to criticize an industry, does my individual experience really matter that much? Can I not say that Chipotle needs to do better if I didn't get E. coli eating at Chipotle? I have a very complicated relationship with adoption. I wouldn't say I'm happy to be adopted, but I don't know if I would say it's as negative as maybe some other adopted people would say. And for me, really, the idea of my story being politicized and used as kind of ammunition to prop up, we should continue doing adoption, not just by adoption agencies, but really by regulators, right? Adoption is the United States government's cruel solution to poverty and I would say like crisis pregnancies and people who feel helpless. Our solution as a country is to take those people's children and send them to more deserving families. And it's been that solution, really, if you look back to the 1920s when Georgia Tann was trafficking children. I mean, that's really what it all comes back to. Also, I'm working on this manifesto video right now on YouTube. And it's everything about open adoption. You can look at the way things are running today. It looks more like Georgia Tann's business than it looks like what adoption looked like before Georgia Tann ever entered the picture. And I think it's crazy that we have a child welfare system that saw decades of literal human trafficking with children and not only retroactively legalized all of those illegal adoptions once she died, but also spent decades and decades and decades not at doing any level of reflection as to why adoption looks the way it looks and functions the way it functions. I see what I do as if I make a video that reaches a bunch of people, a lot of people are going to be really upset. But I think the people that are really upset the first time maybe see or hear something from me or someone else who's adopted the second time, and maybe they're a little bit more understanding of this isn't the first time I've heard this. And so if I can just keep on changing public perceptions, not even changing perceptions, but just provoking people with the idea that adoption isn't the way they believe it is. If I can do that, I think slowly but surely, hopefully, people will start to understand that it's not as simple as they make it out to be or they believe it to be. And really, again, I want adoption agencies to be held accountable. And we know because adopted people have been literally advocating for 50 plus years just for our own vital documents or our vital records that adoption agencies have zero desire and have zero motivation to do what adopted people want them to do, to act in the best interests of adopted people. They're going to continue to do what they think is best for them until, basically, I think you can affect the demand of adoptable children. And so I'm trying to really hit the industry where it hurts them, but also to affect the demand and the supply side of the industry. The only way that this industry will really change is by, I believe, through public pressure, because I don't trust legislators to do it. I don't trust adopted people's advocacy to go that far, even though I want it to go far. And I will fly to Sacramento the next time we have a bill on the table for adopted people to get unconditional access to our birth certificates. Yeah, I don't really think the politics is as effective as changing people's minds about things because I've seen it with my own family that my adoptive family can hold space for my really, really negative feelings about adoption. And not everyone in my life can. But if I can do it with people who I fought with for like every single day of like 20 years of my life, I think a lot of people have the capacity to listen and understand.
I think it's a good game plan because when I wrote my book, I was like, okay, people read this and just take a glimpse and go, oh, I didn't know adopted people had suffered that way. Trying to change the hearts and minds of the public to be more educated about adoptee rights and to make more informed choices in conversation, but certainly in voting and enacting public policy. One of the library talks I gave recently, a couple of people attended who had been instrumental in opening the birth records in New Jersey. It took them 35 years. And they said when they first went down to Trenton, when the bill first came up, there was opposition there from the Catholic priests, lawyers representing birth parents, and the ACLU was there. And I'm like, whose liberties are being more infringed upon than children who are being given away and their identities sealed by no choice of their own? I mean, we're the innocent victims. I can't believe they were defending the rights of either of the parents involved in that. The adoptees should have been at the center there. I was shocked to hear the stories of the kind of opposition to these fights. And it was very sobering. People that you never would have thought would have acted against. But again, they don't understand. And I think your efforts to just like repeating the message, or I should say one message gets through when others don't, is a very hopeful one. I wish you a lot of success there because it's really frustrating to try and figure out how to get this through people's minds who don't know anything about it. They just so want to hold on to the fairy tale.
The videos that have done well historically, not just for me, but for other people in adoption, have always been the videos of babies being taken out of their mother's arms. Like people really, if they actually see it and realize it's in front of them, they can understand it. But how often does anyone see a child being taken from its mother's arms? How often does anyone associate someone like you or me as a person who was removed from our mother, right? Like those things, we kind of just look at adoption. I mean, even the word itself, right? Adoption. We look at it as the act of being added to someone, not being taken away from someone. And open adoption, too. I mean, it's like going back to our earlier conversation, it's very precise language. I would say that my adoption was open. Open just means that the information is accessible on both sides. Not to the child, of course, but to the natural family and to the adoptive family. They have the information available to them. And if they want to share it with me, then they can. But it's still not my decision to make. And I feel like, yeah, it's really disappointing that I think the language has been used so deliberately to paint a picture of what adoption looks like. I think these adoption agencies and this whole industry have been incredibly deliberate about the way that they talk about all of this stuff, the way that language is used, the story that they're trying to tell. Again, you can go back 50 years and you can see exactly why open adoption became what it is. And really, it's crazy to look that in this first thing they ever said about open adoption, they're talking about everything you're saying. They literally will explicitly say, adoptive families need to feel entitled to their children. We want that to happen. And I'm just like, wait, what? Why are we trying to feed into this when 2 paragraphs earlier you're talking about how we were too focused on the adoptive families? We need to be more focused on the adopted people. It's kind of insane. And yeah, I really just want people to hear it, And if I have to be the guy that takes all these punches, I can take it because I can just turn my phone on mute or whatever.
People have to know that these birth moms, they have the agency people and the adoptive parents in the hospital. The one girl sitting there in her hospital slippers and hospital gown, turning over her baby, and she's upset. And the adoptive mother's like, no, you're okay. Oh my God, it's almost too painful to look at. But also what no one is talking about is what is that baby experiencing? And we know now, we have research, we have proof, we know babies are not blank slates, and all that they feel and all that they're aware of, they may not be able to recall it later in life because they didn't have language at the time. But that infant also knows that they're leaving the arms and the smell and the cadence and everything of the woman they were connected to for 9 months, and they are being handed to strangers who don't think, sound, move, smell, anything like, and they're just being taken off by who are these people? And what am I doing with them? I recently, last year, found the first photographs I'd ever seen of myself the day I was adopted. And I'd never been shown them, never knew they existed. And I am open mouth screaming in every picture. And they keep taking pictures, like I'm in this picture and that picture, and handed to a grandmother and put down. I mean, obviously the photo shoot didn't stop, but I am open mouth screaming in every picture. And I'm like, well, that sounds right. Like, who are these people? I was never shown those pictures and never any discussion about that. But yeah, those videos, I mean, people got to realize that these women are being asked to make these decisions when they're 24 hours out of giving birth. It's just insane.
Cam Lee Small's another adopted person who I've heard him share on one of these podcasts that he got flown from Korea to the US and was trying to run back onto the plane and go home. I think it's very telling that the viral adoption videos almost always have music because the music distracts you from the feelings that the adopted person might be experiencing, and to a lesser extent, the mother as well. But yeah, a baby being taken away from its mother isn't thinking, oh, well, that makes sense because there's this piece of paper that was signed in the other room. And so now, yeah, of course, I'm with these people now. Like, we don't even see the pen being touched to the paper. Even if you're showing me, right, here's a baby. Here, baby, I'm signing this contract for you. The baby isn't going to know.
What would it take for that mother to have kept the child? Again, it's changed so much. When I was adopted, I mean, you couldn't admit to having premarital sex and you couldn't be a single mother, and that was just the end of the story. But now it's so different. There aren't those same taboos. And oftentimes it is an economic decision. And yet the adoptive parents are about to get a big tax credit for adopting that child.
On top of that, the adoption industry right now is trying to lobby to make the tax credit refundable because it's not enough to just be able to get up to $17,000 back. We want to make sure they get that full tax credit no matter what, even if they're rich.
Gretchen Sison points out sometimes, and certainly the birth mothers she looked at in over 10 years for her book, sometimes, $5,000 would have made the difference between keeping her child or not. And I think I saw that same video you referred to there, little Korean boy, he's old enough to walk and look, and he's looking at these strange looking Americans who are in his face, and he just keeps trying to run back onto the plane. And it's just, it's cruel. It's just cruel and heartbreaking. Are there things that we didn't cover? There are things that you'd like people to know or you'd like to say? And also, please give everyone all your handles so they know where to find you.
Yeah, people can follow me at Adopted Connor. I really just want to say I appreciate you sharing your story. I feel like to the point you made earlier about waiting until your parents die, and I laughed because you're like, they died in their 90s. I think there are parts of me, as comfortable as I am with my circumstances, where I wonder what will change when that day comes. And I think it's really sad that even since Nancy Verrier was writing about adoption decades ago, that this has always kind of been an observation that adopted people wait a lot of times until their adoptive families are dead to change their name or tell their stories or to even just have a conversation about how they feel. And so I think the work that you're doing in writing your book and trying to help people understand what it's like is really, really important. What I do, I would say, is just trying to connect with the people that aren't like us, but in a similar way. I feel like there is such an importance in adopted people understanding this stuff because, once upon a time, I gave a whole presentation in my study abroad program about how adoption was the greatest thing ever. And I love open adoption and it saved my life. It's really difficult to get to a point in your life where you're able to allow yourself, I would say, to even think the thoughts that you've always been thinking.
It's hard work, as you know, to go there and to deal with it all because there's a lot there. So you're directing your content to try and educate those who haven't lived it is the only way we're going to make change. And what other platforms do you post a lot of things on? And you want to tell us quickly about any of the projects you're working on?
Sure, yeah. I mean, if I'm shouting anything out, it's my YouTube channel. I post all of my short videos everywhere, anywhere on social media. But right now, I'm trying to work with an editor on long form content on YouTube. I've been working on a video on Georgia Tan and the history of adoption, dating all the way like up to today, basically, and kind of looking at how open adoption still today almost looks exactly the same way. Obviously, there's details that are different, but I would call it basically my manifesto. I'm almost done with the script. It's like 30 something pages long, maybe 40 by the time I'm done. And I'm really proud of it. I think that people who are watching this conversation should definitely read your book. I'm excited for all the work you're doing.
Thank you for taking time to have this conversation today. And again, I applaud your work and certainly hope you're very successful because it's so important. Thank you for listening to Voices of Adoption. I'm your host, Janet Sherlund. You can find me online at abandonedatbirthbook.com and on Instagram at Janet Sherlund Official. My book, Abandoned at Birth, is available through Amazon, Barnes & Noble, Books A Million, and bookshop.org.